Good afternoon, folks. My name is Jimmy Bashar with our Stakeholder Engagement Group. Of course, Happy New Year. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Stakeholder Call to discuss the draft final proposal for the Central Procurement Entity, or CPE, initiative. Before we begin, just a courtesy reminder that this call is being recorded for convenience purposes, and that we please request that any related transcriptions not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. Our meetings here are structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives. As such, please keep comments professional and respectful, and please try to be brief and refrain from repeating what has already been said so that we can manage the time efficiently. As a reminder to those not already familiar, if you'd like to ask a question, please enter the queue. You can do so by pressing the virtual raise hand icon. However, if you dialed in separately, then you would push #2 on your telephone keypad. While we do monitor for chat questions, we do prefer verbal questions, and we'll be sure to verbalize any chat questions that we can. Our agenda for today, as you can see, is to begin by discussing the draft final proposal in detail, which include the CPE proposal that Bridget Sparks from our policy division and our lead for this effort will present, as well as the proposal for modifications to our RAIN, or Resource Adequacy Availability Incentive Mechanism, that James Lynn from our Settlements Department will present. I'm also joined today by Abdul Muhammad Ali from our Operations Engineering Group, Catalin Misha from our Transmission Infrastructure Planning Group, David Zlotlo from our Legal Group, and John Gooden also from our Policy Group. Here's also a typical display of our stakeholder process that you may also be familiar with. Unlike other ISOs, it's very simple and open to participate with no committee structure. As you can see, prior to the final proposal, we discussed the draft tariff and draft final proposal in detail prior to incorporating stakeholder input, prior to seeking board approval before we file it FERC in preparation for implementation. And before I hand it off to Bridget, here is the timeline that we are intending on moving forward with. As you can see, after today, we are requesting comments on today's discussion by January 20th, and you can look forward to the associated draft tariff call next week once we've had a chance to digest those comments that are coming in today. And following that, we are targeting the final proposal and revised draft tariff call in February so that we have time to review further stakeholder input before the board in March, as you can see. All so that we can prepare for the October implementation of this year, so that we can be RA compliant for next year, or sorry, for 2023, and implementation 2022, to clarify. Sorry about that. And with that, I'll hand it over to Bridget.
Thank you, Jimmy. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, we're going to start off with a brief background of where the Central Procurement Entity is coming from. The next slide. So the impetus of this initiative is from CPC Order 20-06-002, where the CPUC adopted the Central Procurement Entity framework and ordered FCE and PG&E to form separate Central Procurement Entities for their respective TAC areas and to make multi-year showings starting in RA year 2023. So under this order, the CPUC would no longer assign LSEs a local obligation, but would instead assign the entire local obligation to the CPE. Within this framework, they adopted a hybrid procurement framework where individual LSEs that had procured a local resource could make this available to the CPE by either bidding the resource into the CPE solicitation, retaining the system and flex attributes of the resource and not showing it for local, or agree to self-show the resource, which would reduce the CP's overall procurement requirement in the eyes of the CPUC, and then the local attributes would then be allocated to all LLCs. This order allows the CPE to use the CAISO's backstop as a check against market power in the local RA market, and orders the use of CAM credits to allocate the system and flex attributes of any local resources procured by the CPE to all other LLCs. Next slide. The CPUC is currently conducting another stakeholder process where they're considering further modifications to this original order. So in proceeding 21-10-002, the scope includes consideration of potential modifications to the CPE structure and process, including implementation details of the shown resource component of the hybrid framework and changes to the CPE timeline. In recognition that this is an ongoing process, the CAISO has identified areas of flexibility within our tariff and systems and proposes to build in this flexibility to accommodate some of the changes that may result in an order from this ongoing proceeding. The CAISO has also been and will continue to be an active participant in this proceeding to ensure that our programs stay aligned to the best extent possible. Next slide. So there were some stakeholder comments asking about how we're making sure that these two processes are going to be aligned, given the fact that the CPUC process isn't closed book just yet. And so the CPUC is expected to publish a proposed decision on February 1st and a final decision on March. However, the CAISO needs to conduct this stakeholder process in parallel with the CPUC's process to ensure that we can get any necessary tariff changes approved by our board and FERC and systems changed and implemented in advance of the October 31 showings deadline for RA year 2023. So again, we recognize that while the CPE may not be completely finished policy in certain areas, we do know that the CPE is going to be having to make showings this fall, and so in order to be ready to accommodate those showings, we have to move this process along in parallel. But again, we've been monitoring both processes closely, and we think that the draft final that we're presenting today will work reasonably well for any proposed decision that might come out of the CPUC. And to the extent that the proposed decision flags areas of policy that we may not have considered, there is opportunities to rectify that in the final just proposal at the CAISO before we take it to the March Board of Governors. So with that, I will pause to see if there are any questions on background or alignment with the CPUC process.
Thanks, Bridget. I'm not seeing any questions, Chris, unless you're seeing something on your end.
I don't see any questions in queue.
Okay, so we can move to the next section. So next we're going to get into the CAISO's proposal for CPE implementation. So before we get into the actual proposal, we thought it'd be helpful to provide another refresher on how the CAISO does our local resource adequacy program. So first, the CAISO conducts annual local capacity technical studies to determine the minimum megawatts of local capacity area resources needed within each local area and sub-area, and identifying the generating units within each local capacity area that meet that requirement. Next slide. So once we've determined the local need, the CAISO then allocates the local requirements to direct procurement of these local resources. For non-CPUC jurisdictional LSCs, the CAISO directly allocates the local obligations based on a pro rata share of the LSC's load in each TAC area. For CPUC jurisdictional entities, the CAISO sums up the total need in each TAC area for each CPUC jurisdictional LSC and sends this to the CPUC, who can then reallocate the requirements using a method of their choice. The CPUC then submits the reallocated local obligation among their jurisdictional entities and gives that information back to the CAISO for inclusion in our own system. If the CPUC reallocated obligations are below what the CAISO had originally identified as the local need, then any remaining requirement will be assigned by the CAISO to these LSCs using the CAISO's default methodology, which again is that pro rata load share in each TAC area. Next slide. So once LSCs do their procurement, these procured local resources that satisfy the generating capacity requirements of the local capacity areas are put on annual and monthly RA plans. CAISO then validates the resulting portfolio of all shown RA resources to cover the identified needs in the local capacity technical studies. So not only do we study resources that are explicitly shown for local, but we'll also evaluate system and flex resources in these local capacity technical studies to determine if the needs were met. If we identify through the study process that there is a deficiency, we notify LSCs of this deficiency, and they are offered a cure period in which to rectify this deficiency. And so for the annual process, this is a 30-day cure period, and for the monthly process, it is a 15-day cure period. Next slide. So after this cure period, if no other resources are shown to the CAISO and a deficiency remains, the CAISO can issue a local CPM to procure additional capacity that may be needed to ensure reliability in the local area and sub-areas. Once we do the CPM process, costs are first allocated to any individual deficient entity, and if further deficiencies remain, after the individual deficiencies are allocated, then we designate a collective local deficiency, and this is allocated on a pro rata share to all LSCs in the TAC area. Next slide. So with that existing process, these next set of slides explain how we propose to incorporate the CPE entity into this existing process. So the CAISO proposes that the CPE will be defined as a market participant and will be represented by a scheduling coordinator. CAISO will need to execute a pro forma SC agreement with the CPE, and a new pro forma agreement is under development, and more details will be provided with the final proposal. The CAISO will also add a new subsection in the tariff, section 4.18, to define the scope of the CPE. And we'll be going over the details of this tariff section next week during the tariff call. The CPE will be subject to the scheduling coordinator ID GMC charge. Next slide. The CPE will be responsible for submitting annual and monthly RA plans to the CAISO following our existing RA submission timelines. The CPE will be subject to late or missing submission penalties. And although the CPUC ordered multi-year procurement for local RA, the CAISO will be maintaining its annual showings process. And so the CPE should plan to make annual showings with the CAISO. Next slide. So the CAISO will continue to calculate the total local capacity area obligations of CPUC jurisdictional LSCs and transmit these to the CPUC. The CPUC may then allocate these local obligations to its LSCs using its own allocation methodology. If the CPUC does not allocate the total sum, the CAISO will allocate any remaining local obligation to the relevant LSCs using our default methodology as outlined in section 40.3.2. The CAISO proposes to modify tariff section 40.3.2a to allow an LSC or a CPE to be assigned a local RA obligation. So the change here is that we will still be giving the local obligation to the CPUC, and now the tariff will reflect the fact that the CPUC can designate a CPE to carry that local obligation. Next slide. For non-CPC jurisdictional entities, we will continue to assign a local obligation using the allocation methodology outlined in section 40.3.2.a. And we propose to add an opportunity in which LRAs may choose to shift all or part of the LOC's local obligation to a CPE. And the CAISO will allow multiple LRAs to utilize or designate the same CPE. So in recognition that non-CPUC LRAs tend to be smaller and may only represent a single LOC, we felt that allowing multiple LRAs to designate the same CPE would allow them to essentially concentrate their buying power and make the CPE contract more effective under smaller LRAs. Again, this will be optional, and so there's no requirements that an LRA, other than CPUC jurisdictional entities, elect or designate a CPE. Next slide. So the CAISO received fairly favorable comments from stakeholders. So all commenting parties, which included CalCCA, CDWR, the CPUC, Energy Division staff, Middle River Power, PG&E, and SCE, were generally supportive of the CAISO's efforts to recognize and incorporate the CPE into our tariff and system. Middle River Power supported requiring the CPE to be represented by a scheduling coordinator, which would also allow the CPE to be the scheduling coordinator for any resource over which it had also secured the dispatch rights, which is allowed for in the CPUC order. CDWR supported retention of the CAISO's annual RA showings process and the option to shift local obligations to a CPE, but continuing to directly allocate the local requirements directly to non-CPUC jurisdictional entities. Next slide. PG&E asked for more details on the new subsection 4 of the tariff and the pro forma agreement. So with this draft final proposal, the draft tariff language was also posted, and so parties can go review that tariff language now, and we're also accepting comments on that language through the end of today, and we'll have a stakeholder call next Thursday to discuss that further. And then we are still working with our regulatory contracts team to develop the pro forma language, and we'll make this available with the final proposal. But we imagine that this pro forma agreement will be modeled similar to what we have for our CRRs, and will basically just help us establish the relationship between the CPE and the CAISO. So as you'll see later, because the CPE will be getting potentially a bill for CPM cost allocations, we feel it necessary to establish this contractual relationship because money will be involved. PG&E also asked that the CPE would be allowed to net any credit requirements for establishing the new scheduling coordinate ID with that of the utility it operates under, since they are the same financial and legal entity. So the CAISO is continuing internal discussions on this request, and we'll have a final answer in the next paper. So we don't quite have a response back on that question, but we will have an answer before the next paper. So with that, I will pause to see if there are any questions or comments on this first section.
Thanks, Bridget. A lot of information, and we appreciate the comments. But before we end this section, maybe, oh, looks like we do have one.
So we do have one caller in queue. And a caller, your line is now unmuted.
Hi, this is Noah Tang from Middle River Power. Happy New Year, Bridget. Question for you. In the slide, you had one about annual showings. I'm wondering whether or not you would also intended to include monthly showings because for the validation purposes, or is the expectation that there's an annual showing by the CPE and sort of suppliers and sort of just carries forward for the entire year? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. That might have been a typo, but our intention is that the CPE would be making annual and monthly showings at the CAISO, following the existing showings timeline.
All right, and at this time, I don't see any more callers in queue.
Okay. Next slide. So this next section outlines the system and local obligations of the CPE. So since the CPE is a procurement entity, it will not be assigned a load share. Section 40.2.3a states that an LSC will not be assigned a local obligation in excess of their system obligation for the applicable month. The CAISO proposes to exempt the CPE or LSCs without load share and attack area from this provision of the tariff and develop software enhancements to support this exemption. If the CPE or an LSC that was assigned a local obligation in a different tax area where they did not have a load share were not exempt, an entity's local obligation would be capped at 0 megawatts and thus would not be committed to show any capacity to meet its assigned local obligation. So this is a change from the prior proposal. In our initial straw proposal, we had only proposed to exempt the CPE from this tariff provision, but based on stakeholder feedback that we got, there was concern if the commission changed their order and allowed LSCs to be reassigned some portion of the local obligation. There could be instances where a LSC that wasn't in the specific TAC area could agree to self-show a resource, and there was concern that there might be some sort of loophole created where that LLC would not actually be obligated from the CAISO's perspective to show that resource. So in order to prevent any sort of loophole from it being established, again, the CAISO has proposed a modification to its original proposal to exempt both the CPE and, again, LLCs without load share in a TAC area from this tariff provision. Next slide. So on a separate but related issue, it was brought to our attention that there's a potential issue where if an LLC serves load in multiple TAC areas, they will be assigned a local obligation in each TAC area. And under the current existing tariff provisions where the local obligations will be capped at their entire system obligation, this could lead to higher local CPM cost allocation as compared to an LSC with load in a single TAC area. Next slide. So in order to address this issue, the CAISO proposes to modify this tariff section to allow for LSCs with load in multiple TAC areas to cap an LLC's local obligation at their applicable demand and reserve margin requirements in each TAC area in the applicable month. So rather than capping the sorry, just lost my train of thought. So basically what this is doing is rather than capping the local obligation at their entire system obligation, it would cap each local obligation at the load share in that individual TAC area. And so this should reduce the local CPM cost allocation to be on par with LLCs who have load in a single TAC area. Next slide. So stakeholder comments were generally supportive of this proposal, but asked several clarifying questions. So CDWR asked whether the proposal to cap local at system in each TAC area for LLCs with load in multiple TAC areas would apply to annual or monthly showings. And so the CAISO clarifies that the existing tariff provision only applies to monthly showings process. And so this proposed tariff change would also only apply to the monthly showings process. PG&E was concerned that the prior tariff provisions, again, could create a loophole that would allow the LLC to get out of their assigned local obligation. And so in recognition of this feedback, again, the CAISO has modified the proposal to exempt any entity without load share in a TAC area that was assigned a local obligation. Their local obligation would be exempted from not being able to exceed their system obligation in that tax area. So with that, I will pause for questions and feedback.
So it looks like we do have a caller in queue. And caller, your line is now unmuted.
Hi, this is Chris Devin with Customized Energy Solutions. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks. Hi, Bridget. Thanks for the presentation. I just had a quick clarifying question on the prior slide regarding the split of the LSCs amongst the kind of TAC areas and how you would be able to determine their load ratio share. Is that going to require some changes to the kind of forecasting and SIRA process at all, or is that already kind of built into your systems? Do you have any sense of that at this point, or is this kind of a new thing that you guys are going to have to determine how to do?
Abdul, do you want to take that one?
Yes. Hey, Chris, this is Abdul. Yeah, we will have to make system change here in SIRA to allow for this proposal.
Okay, and then do you think it's going to be kind of part of the CEC RA forecasting part of it, where they actually have to kind of indicate the split between the different TAC areas, or is that going to be something that CAISO maybe thinks that they're going to work out with the LSCs between the CAISO and the LSCs, or how are you really thinking you might actually identify that split within those different load ratio shares of the different TAC areas?
Okay, I see what you're saying. Okay, so yeah, that process would not change because today we're getting the forecast from the CEC divided by TAC for each LSC. So each LSC today gets the CEC forecast and it's per TAC. When we come up with a system obligation for each LSC, we add all those values in each TAC for each LSC, and then add the PRM, and that's how we come up with their system obligation. That is based on the CEC forecast. So with this change, we will take the same values from the CEC, which is the forecast, the big forecast per TAC per LSC, and we would keep them separated per TAC, add the PRM to each TAC, and use that value to cap the local obligation for each LSC in that each TAC, and that's how we're planning to implement this basically.
Okay, that sounds good. That helps me understand it better, and I appreciate the clarification there. I wasn't quite sure exactly how they were transmitting that over from the CEC to CAISO, but it sounds like it's just more of a systems change in SIRA to be able to identify that, and not so much any kind of change to the forecasting process. So that sounds like it should be relatively straightforward, and I appreciate the clarification. Thanks, Abdul.
Yep, you're welcome.
All right, we're on to our next caller in queue. Caller, your line is now unmuted.
Hi, this is Noah Tom from Middle River Power again. Can we go back to slide 22? I'm a little confused as to what this is proposing. It would be helpful maybe to have a numerical example as well.
Sure. So let's take an instance where, so obviously the CPE doesn't have a load share, so they have a zero system obligation. So if we went with the current provision, we would be capping the CPE at zero because they don't have any load share. So for the CPE, it's pretty straightforward. Since they don't have a load share, they don't have a system obligation, they're just a local entity, it makes sense that we shouldn't be capping their local obligation and leave it up to the LRA to make sure that whatever they're assigning that entity is reasonable. For LSCs, though, so this is really just in a world where if the CPUC decides to modify their original order, which today is assigning the entire obligation to CPE, we have a proposal in that proceeding to get them to modify that original language, which will allow them to shift part of the local obligation back to the LSC that's agreed to self-show. So say, for instance, you have a CCA that owns a local resource in the PG&E TAC area, but their load is in the SCE TAC area. And so for whatever reason, they want to count that resource for their system, and so they sell the local attributes or agree to self-show their local attributes with this PG&E CPE. So say it's a 100 megawatt resource. So when it comes to the CAISO, the CPUC could assign that CCA 100 megawatt local obligation in the PG&E TAC area. And if we weren't exempting that entity, there could be a case where since that CCA has a zero system load share in that TAC area, then it could essentially possibly be seen as zero, or they wouldn't be on the hook necessarily because our systems would say, hey, you don't have any load share. So if your local can't exceed your system, then you really only have a zero local share. And so we're trying to get around that by saying, if you don't have a load share in the TAC area, but you've been assigned an obligation, we're allowing that local obligation to be higher than any system obligation. Does that make sense?
I see. Okay. And how does that impact cost allocation for CPM if you're exempting and or essentially, going through with having that LSE that's not in the TAC area have a local obligation? Do you then assign CPM to cost to that LSE because it now has a local obligation even though it's not in the TAC area?
Correct. So because the LRA said, hey, you're agreeing to either show this resource, and so now we're shifting this obligation back to you, or basically assigning you this local obligation, even if you're not in that TAC area, then yes, for our system purposes, we would see that assignment. And then if we had to designate a local deficiency and that LSE didn't show the resource they had agreed to show, then yes, they would be getting cost allocated based on that assigned obligation by the LRA. For an individual collective deficiency, but for a collective, so say we still had leftover deficiency and we designated it a collective CPM, then that LSC wouldn't receive cost allocation in that instance because they don't have load share in that TAC area. So really, they'd only be getting cost allocation from an individual deficiency because, again, they were assigned that obligation by the LRA.
It's possible that I guess the reasoning in your mind is that it is because that LSC elected to self-show and therefore take on the obligation of the local requirements in that particular TAC area, and therefore it doesn't matter if their customers aren't in that TAC area to receive a cost allocation because of non-performance for the self-shown resource.
Right.
Okay, and then for the other part of you said it was, and I apologize, it's either cumulative or I think it's cumulative.
Yeah.
Yeah. The two C's there. You would, or generally speaking, ISO would allocate cost pro rata to LSCs in a particular TAC area, but because of there's an assignment of obligation to the CPE, you would assign it to the CPE, or I'm sorry, you would allocate cost to the CPE, and the CPE under the CPUC's process essentially assigns costs of CPM pro rata to the customers. So I'm trying to understand the sort of it seems like the same cost allocation methodology, and I'm just wondering about whether or not it's necessary to go through the CPE if it's the same cost allocation.
So we'll get into this in the last section. But basically, so we have two flavors of local CPM. The first flavor is that individual deficiency, and that allocation is based on who was assigned upfront that local obligation. And so if the CPE gets the majority share of the local obligation, then the individual collective deficiency would likely first go to the CPE because they have the lion's share of the local obligation. If some portion of that local obligation was distributed back to other LSCs and they didn't meet their obligation, then they would also get assigned costs. So once we do all of that and fill up all of the deficiencies first by going kind of assigning costs first to the LSC, CPE that didn't fulfill their upfront obligation, and say we still had 100 megawatts left over that we still needed resources to cover, but we had filled it all in with the individual deficient LSCs, then we would designate a collective, and that cost allocation would then go to all LSCs on a pro rata load share. So it doesn't really matter who was assigned the obligation up front. If everybody is fulfilling their obligations or we fulfilled it for them through CPM, but there's for whatever reason still a deficiency, then that goes pro rata to all the LSCs, and the CPE in that instance wouldn't be getting cost allocation in recognition that they're the middleman. And so for a collective deficiency, we would expect them to then distribute it pro rata to the LSCs. And so we're kind of just cutting out the CPE as a middleman in that collective instance. But again, for the first flavor of individual deficiencies, that is all based on who the LRA assigned the obligation to. That's who then we turn around and assign cost allocations to if they're deficient.
And this is right. Okay, so this is under the scenario in which the CPC has agreed or adopted CAISO's proposal to assign allocation to self-shown LSCs. What happens if the CPC does not adopt this and still assigns the entire obligation to the CPE? Is there just like, there's no individual LSCs, so the CAISO will essentially, view everything as a both collective and cumulative at the same time?
So we would still be designating an individual, and so the CPE would then be the party that would get the entire bill. And then it would be up to the CPE to decide how they wanted to distribute those costs to its LSCs it represents. And so basically, under the status quo, so yes, if the CPC doesn't change anything in the order and it's exactly as it's written today, they've said explicitly the entire obligation is getting assigned to the CPE. So what they're going to report is to us before the annual showings is, hey, we gave all 10,000 megawatts of the local requirement to the PG&E CPE. So in our systems, we would be validating, did the CPE procure to those 10,000 megawatts? If they were short, say they were short 1,000 megawatts, and we had to CPM 1,000 megawatts, then that entire bill of 1,000 megawatts would go to the CPE. And then it's very unlikely in that case then that if we still had to designate a collective deficiency, so say we, filled up the entire CPE bucket and there was still that 100 megawatts short for whatever reason, then that 100 megawatts would be billed to the LSCs directly on a pro rata load share.
Okay, thanks for that.
All right, at this time, I don't see any more callers in queue.
Okay, I think we can go to slide 26. Okay, so this next section describes how we propose to allocate the system and flex attributes of the local resources. So the system and local resources of an RA resource cannot be unbundled. And so in recognition of this, the CPUC ordered the CPE to buy the bundled attributes of the resource. and we'll use CAM credits to allocate the system and flex attributes of the resources back to LSEs that they can use to meet their own system and flex RA obligations. In order to accommodate this credit in our system, the CAISO proposes to implement separate fields in the LRA credit templates in CIRA to accept and validate system CPE credits, which is basically what we're calling this new flavor of CAM credits, but recognizing that this is specifically for the CPE credits. The CAISO will require that all CPE system credits allocated to LSEs must match the exact quantity of the local resources shown by the CPE or that the LRA expects the CPE to show. Next slide. The CAISO currently does not have the functionality to accept and validate flex RA CAM credits, and so we're proposing to build and implement separate fields in the LRA credit templates in CIRA to accept and validate this new CPE flexible RA credit, which again is similar to the existing CAM credits for system, but will be for the flex attributes of the resource. Again, the CAISO will require that all flexible credits allocated to LSEs match the exact quantity of the flexible RA capacity shown by the CPE, or that the LRA expects the CPE to show. So to the extent that a local resource also has flex RA attributes, again, these credits will be used to allocate out those attributes to the LSEs, which will then be used to lower the remaining flex allocation that they have to show to the CAISO. Next slide. So stakeholders did not offer any objections or modifications to these proposals, so this section hasn't changed. CDWR commented that they support the RA attributes of resources remaining bundled and the use of credits to assign attributes. CPUC also supported this proposal and our efforts to keep the programs aligned. And PG&E also supported this approach and believed that it supported the hybrid procurement framework adopted by the CPUC. So with that, I'll pause to see if there's any questions on system and flex allocation.
At this time, I don't see any callers in queue. Oh, I do see a caller who just joined in. Give me a second. All right, and caller, your line is now unmuted.
Hi, this is Jamie Gannon from the CPUC, and my question is not actually on this section, but it's on the prior section, Bridget. And apologies, I didn't get my hand raised fast enough when you were going through that section. So it's on the capping local at system components that you've changed. And I just wanted to kind of walk through another example. The example that you gave was a load serving entity that was not serving load in a TAC area, and was showing a resource, to the CPE for that area that it wasn't serving load in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I think what you're proposing is kind of only applicable to that scenario. And because I'm thinking of like another scenario where you have a load serving entity, and it's serving load, maybe a small amount of load in the PG&E TAC area. However, it's meeting its system requirements, with a large resource that is located in a local area in the PG&E area. And so let's just say its load in PG&E's area is 20 megawatts, and its resource that it has there is 80 megawatts in the Bay Area. My question is, this LSC would not be exempt from the capping local at system, and so therefore it would only be required to show 20 megawatts or, add on the 15% planning reserve margin. But am I thinking about that correctly?
Yeah, under that scenario, they would still be subject to that provision on a monthly basis. So in the monthly time frame, if they only had 80 megawatt system load, but if you were to assign them a 100 megawatt local assignment under the existing tariff provision, then we would be capping the system at their local in those instances. And that just might be a risk of this proposal, but I don't see a way around it necessarily other than to say we exempt everybody from the capping at local at their system, which I think could potentially be problematic for some of the other entities. So I think in that case, that's kind of, yes, they wouldn't be exempt from that provision. And so in that specific instance, their system and their local would be capped as it is today.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I was understanding kind of the resolution there would only kind of be applicable to one scenario, not all scenarios. And can you remind me kind of again the magnitude of the problem that you're trying to address, you know, by this exemption, changing this exemption to apply to like individual system load by TAC versus, you know, versus the current tariff language?
I'm not like quite sure of like the megawatt magnitude of that kind of issue, but it has been something that's been raised multiple times by a couple other LRAs who we do the assignment of the local obligation based on their pro rata load share. So I think it's just trying to recognize and provide a cap that our assignment of the local obligation isn't going to exceed what their system obligation is. And because if we had to designate a cultural deficiency in local areas, if you're a LSC that has load in multiple TAC areas, and so your basically it could impact how much cost allocations you would receive. So it's really an issue to do more with if we had to do a CPM and had to do a collective deficiency, you could be on the hook for more of an allocation than you would be if you were an LSC with only load in a single TAC area.
Okay, thanks, Bridget. Appreciate that.
All right, and at this time, I don't have any more callers in queue.
Okay. So I think we can move to the next slide. So we already briefly went over this in Noah's question, but this next section clarifies our CPM process and cost allocation, and then we'll describe how the CPE will fit into that, and then moves on to discuss potentially how this can work under the hybrid procurement framework. So the CAISO proposes to modify the tariff to apply the existing CPM or capacity procurement mechanism, process, and cost allocation methodology to a CPE as outlined in tariff section 43A. So while we expect minor changes to this tariff section to recognize the CPE in these process, we will need to update our settlement systems to be able to allocate costs to a CPE in addition to individual LLCs in a TAC area. Next slide. So again, after our monthly and annual showings deadline, the CAISO will look at the entire portfolio of shown RA resources to validate that the procured portfolio satisfies the capacity and energy requirements as identified in the local LCR studies. And if a deficiency is identified, the CAISO will offer a CPE and its LSCs an opportunity to cure that deficiency per section 40.7. And again, the CPE or LSCs will have 30 days to cure for the annual showings timeline and 15 days for the monthly. Next slide. The CAISO will then have discretion to determine if additional capacity is needed to fulfill any remaining identified needs. So again, if after this cure period, if no additional resources are offered or if a deficiency continues to remain, the CAISO will first designate an individual deficiency in the local capacity area resources and allocate costs proportional to all deficient LSEs and CPE vis-a-vis their obligation in that TAC area that includes the deficient area and or sub area. So again, based on their upfront assigned local obligation, we will be assigning costs based on that upfront requirement. And then any remaining local capacity deficiency in the year ahead timeframe will be filled through a collective local CPM and allocated pro rata to all LSCs with load in that respective TAC area. So again, once we fill up the deficiencies and assign it to an individual deficient LSC or CPE, and if a deficiency remains, then the next step would be to designate a collective deficiency, and those would be allocated out on a pro rata load share. Next slide. Since under the current construct, a CPE is not assigned a load share, it would not be allocated CPM costs associated with a collective local CPM. And again, because it doesn't have a system obligation, it wouldn't have a system CPM allocation, nor would it have a significant event or exceptional dispatch CPM. Again, in recognition that the CPE is just a local procurement entity, and so it doesn't have load share, and it's just a middleman. And so these other flavors of CPM, it makes sense to not include the CPE in these cost allocation methodologies. In the future, were an LRA to assign a CPE a system or flex obligation, the CAISO would have to open a separate stakeholder process to consider additional tariff modifications to incorporate the CPE into these other flavors of CPM, as well as other tariff provisions as related to system and flex obligations. So with that, I'll pause for questions, and I see we already have one in the queue.
And then caller, your line is now unmuted.
Bridget, this is Brian Dacre with Middle River Power. May I take you back to slide 31, please?
Sure.
With regard to the middle bullet, under the CPE structure, LSCs don't have local capacity obligations. If I understand correctly, in the future, the only time they would is if the PUC adopts the IS's proposal to allocate a local capacity obligation to self-showing LSCs. So I'm struggling to posit a scenario where there's a deficient LSC that would be allocated, that would be allocated any CPM costs pursuant to the second bullet. Can you enlighten me?
Yeah, so the second bullet, also keep in mind that this covers non-CPUC jurisdictional. So this first section really outlines how the overall process works. So keep in mind that we have to do local CPM for non-CPUC jurisdictional entities. And so in that case, the LSCs would still be getting assigned a local obligation by that CAISO. And so in that instance, they would be getting an individual deficiency. But for CPUC jurisdictional entities, you are correct that if the Commission doesn't adopt the CAISO's proposal and maintains their current order, the CPE would be getting assigned the entire deficiency.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
All All right, at this time, I don't have any more callers in queue.
Great. So we can move to the next slide. So if the CAISO designates the CPM, there are RA credits that go along with that CPM. And so currently, only LSEs can receive RA credits from applicable CPM procured resources, and LRAs are allowed to determine whether these credits should be allowed to count towards the RA requirement adopted by the LRA. The CAISO proposes to modify this rule to allow CPEs to receive RA credits from CPM procured resources associated with the LSEs they are representing. And the CAISO proposes to allow the LRAs to reallocate these credits as they see fit amongst its CPE and LSEs in the same way that it can allocate RMR credits amongst their jurisdictional entities. So what this is saying is basically the CAISO will allow the CPUC, if they wanted to allocate out the local attributes of any CPM resources to the CPE and the system in flux to the other LSCs as they see fit. So they can divide the attributes up amongst their jurisdictional entities as they want, and we will accept those credits as long as they, again, add up to the original CPM amount. Next slide. So this next section goes over how the CPM cost allocations will work under the higher procurement framework. And again, kind of goes over a little bit of how the CAISO has proposed this working in the CPUC process. So as a general rule, the CPM cost allocation for any individual local RA deficiency will follow the entity assigned the local obligation by the LRA. So CPM backstop costs will be allocated according to how the LRA apportioned the local capacity obligation upfront. If the CPUC assigns the entire local obligation to CPEs, as is currently specified in Order 2006-002, then the CPEs will carry the entire risk for backstop costs related to individual local CPM designations. And once they receive the bill from the CAISO, it is up to the CPE and the Commission to decide how the CPE should allocate those costs out to its LSCs that it represents. But again, the bill will be going to the CPE from the CAISO. Next slide. So in this process, the CAISO will continue to evaluate the entire portfolio of shown resources in its CPM determination, and will pick up any voluntary showings made by LSCs who have agreed to self-show with the CPE. However, if an LSC fails to show their resources and a deficiency is identified, the CPM costs will first be allocated to the individual deficient LSC or CPE as applicable. So since the CPE will have the largest local obligations, it will be allocated a proportionate share of the CPM costs. And then again, it's up to the CPE to decide how it wants to reallocate costs to its LSCs. Next slide. So if parties would like to change this, they will need to submit proposals in the CPUC proceeding 2110-02 to modify the original CPUC decision that prohibits the CPUC from allocating local obligations to individual LSCs. And so in modifying the decision, this would allow the CPUC to reallocate local obligations to LSCs that agree to self-show their resources. This would allow the CAISO to allocate CPM costs directly to those LSCs if they fail to show their resource to the CAISO and a deficiency is identified, and the CAISO CPM's additional capacity. So what this is basically saying is that under the current rules, the CPE will be getting the entire local obligation, and so even if other entities agree to self-show a resource, if they fail to do so but aren't assigned the obligation by the LRA, then the entire backstop cost will continue to go to the CPE. If parties think that it would be more fair for the LSC that agreed to self-show the resource should have to carry the backstop risk associated with that. If they want the CAISO to be the one to send the bill to that party, then what needs to happen is that then the LRA would have to notify the CAISO upfront of the LSC is now carrying this local obligation. And then if they fail to meet that obligation, then the CAISO would be able to send them the bill. So again, the CAISO can only send the bill to the party that was assigned the obligation upfront, and we can't do any sort of back-end reallocation to parties that weren't assigned the obligation upfront. However, once we send this bill to the CPE, it is completely within their right and the Commission's right to dictate how the CPE should then reallocate those costs to the entities it represents. Next slide. So we received mixed feedback on this proposal of how we're going to include the CPE in the existing CPM processes. So CDWR agreed that the CPE should be allocated CPM costs for individual local RA deficiencies and receive credits after the cost allocation. The CPUC supported this proposal and agrees with the characterization of how the CPM would be applied based on the current CPUC order. CalCCA did not object to the CAISO proposal, but raised concerns that there needs to be more transparency in the CP's procurement process and better documentation explanation as to why they did not procure their full allocation of local RA and deferred it to the CAISO CPM process. So this last bullet, again, is more relevant to the CPUC process, and so there's nothing the CAISO can do to sort of mandate this transparency. And I do recall that CalCCA did raise this in that proceeding, and so would encourage stakeholders to discuss any greater transparency needs in the CPUC process. Next slide. And then we received late comments from CMUA that agree that there should be no significant changes to the character of the CPM and that there should be greater data transparency and tracking of cost causation. And so again, like I reiterates, we have not modified our CPM process, but rather are incorporating the CPE into these existing processes. And then CMUA was also concerned that the increased reliance on CPM due to CPE deferring procurement to the CAISO's backstop process could lead to additional costs to non-CPUC entities, and that CPM wasn't designed to cover front stop requirements. So the CAISO believes that impacts to non-CPUC entities should be minimal, again, because the first CPM designation will go to the individual deficient LSCs, and so the extent to which non-CPUC jurisdictionals are meeting their obligation, there should be very minimal backstop risk. It is also not a common occurrence for the CAISO to designate a collective deficiency. And so, again, we believe that the impact on non-CPUC jurisdictional entities should be minimal. But on our policy roadmap, we have included a separate CPM process enhancements initiative where we will be discussing further policy process enhancements to our CPM process in a separate initiative. And so we could consider CMUA's concerns within that scope and facilitate a broader discussion on improvements to the CPM process in that separate stakeholder initiative. So again, for the CPE impacts on CPM, we think those impacts should be minimal on these other entities. To the extent that parties agree that the CPM process needs additional enhancements, I would direct you to an upcoming separate stakeholder process on CPM process enhancements. Next slide. SCE was generally supportive, but wanted additional clarity on the curing process for the CPE and LLCs in the event of a deficiency. And so again, the CAISO is not proposing any additional changes to the curing process other than to allow the CPE to be allowed to show additional capacity during the cure period. So we'll maintain the notification process, and entities will have 30 days to cure in the annual time frame and 15 days to cure in the monthly. The obligation to show the capacity will remain with the entity assigned the local obligation by the LRA, but all LLCs and CPEs will be allowed to show additional capacity to cure the deficiency. CAISO will also allow any LLC inside or outside the CPE's territory to show capacity that can be used to cure the deficiency of that CPE. Next slide. And then PG&E offered an alternate proposal for CPM cost allocations of local RE deficiencies. They suggested the CAISO modify its tariff to allow LRAs to determine their own cost allocation methodology for individual local deficiencies, and the CAISO would have default provisions. So the CAISO does not support this proposed alternative because it would break, or it could break cost causation principles, in that the CPUC could assign costs to an entity that was not responsible upfront for meeting the local RA obligation. So if the CPUC wants to the costs to be assigned to a different entity other than the CPE, then they will need to allocate the local requirement to that entity prior to showings being submitted to the CAISO and our CPM process running, not after the fact. So again, because the CPUC already has leeway to assign the local obligation upfront to whatever entity they want, as long as it totals the total identified need as assigned by the CAISO, then our individual deficiencies will follow that upfront assignment. And so we think it would break cost causation principles to allow the LRA to designate potentially a different cost allocation methodology that isn't tied to that upfront obligation. And so, but again, once the bill gets sent to the CPE, it's completely within the CPE and the Commission's right to decide how it wants the CPE to allocate those costs back to its jurisdictional entities. But again, if you want the CAISO to be the one sending the bill, then it has to be decided upfront who carries that obligation, and then we will send the bill to whoever was assigned that obligation upfront by the LRA. So with that, I'll pause to see if there's any questions or feedback on this section.
All right, looks like we do have a caller in queue. And caller, your line is now unmuted.
Hi, Bridget. This is Lauren Carr from CalCCA. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Hi, Lauren.
Hi. I was wondering if you could go back to slide 36, please. And I won't take up too much time on this one because I know it doesn't relate to this initiative so much as it does the RA proceeding, but I wanted to get your thoughts on slide 36. I think it was the second bullet. You mentioned potentially modifying the decision to allow the CPUC to allocate local obligations to LSEs who agree to self-show. And I think that's your proposal in the RA proceeding. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the potential disincentives that would create for LSEs to self-show, particularly if an LSE is planning to self-show a resource, but then it goes on outage between when it elects to self-show and the RA showing. We have some concerns about the way the incentives and disincentives are within the hybrid framework, and feel this proposal may potentially create additional disincentives to self-show. Wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think we're still kind of ruminating on those, and we'll have reply comments in the RA proceeding that are a little bit more detailed than what I'm about to offer. But I think our proposal was really geared towards cleaning up the cost allocation of CPM and putting out a proposal that would more cleanly, in our minds, designate who's responsible for the backstop risk, like who should be carrying that backstop risk. And so if a party is agreeing to self-show the resource of the CPE, and so the CPE isn't doing additional procurement because they're expecting that resource to show up in the CAISO's showing process, then it seems to us it might be reasonable to then have that entity carry the backstop risk. If parties disagree and they think that, the higher procurement framework is trying to get LSCs to self-show more resources, and so in order to do that, socializing the backstop risk is a reasonable trade-off to get more self-showing resources. The CAISO doesn't have an opinion on that, but our proposal was really geared towards, if you think it's just and reasonable that the entity that's agreeing to self-show a resource and they don't should have a different cost allocation methodology, and you want the CAISO to be involved in that process, here's how you would have to do that for it to work with our tariffing systems. So that's really what that proposal was geared towards. I don't know that we necessarily have an opinion on incentives or disincentives around self-showing. It's not up for the commission to decide and for parties to decide what's the best way to balance those different incentives and disincentives. But our proposal is really about specifically on the cost allocation and who's carrying the backstop risk. And again, if you want the CAISO to send the bill, here's how that has to work. And that's really what that proposal is about.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. Yeah, I'll think on that more, but thanks for that.
Yeah.
All right, and then moving on to our next caller in queue. All right, caller, your line is now unmuted. All right, that goes by Maria.
Yeah, am I still muted?
No, we can hear you
now.
Okay. So yeah, I'd like to follow on that. And Bridget, I think I know the answer, but let me ask it anyway. So SC's proposal, to what Lauren was saying, in order to incentivize LSCs to self-show, that if there was a planned outage, which we all understand that generators have to take outages, and they don't always know it when they have to provide it to the CPE well in advance, that those costs would be socialized among all customers in the TAC area. But it would only be if there was some kind of a default or non-performance other than taking a planned outage, that really those LSCs should have to step up to that obligation. I know in your system you're saying that you have to allocate that up front. So wondering like how it could potentially happen. So could CAISO, could CPC allocate that, tell CAISO to allocate it up front, but yet you would only pass those costs on if it was a non-performance due to anything other than a planned outage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the designation of a CPM isn't really tied to outages in any way. Mm-hmm. So it's, we don't really have any way of saying, okay, this resource that wasn't on the supply plan because it was on outage and the LSC doesn't have a replacement capacity. In our tariff, it's really on the resource to provide their substitute capacity if they are shown for RA. And so we view the risk on the supplier end to provide the subsidy capacity if they're going on a planned outage. And so, you know, the SC proposal is currently in the RA proceeding. We definitely understand the logic, but there's no real way in our systems to be able to distinguish that. What could possibly work is if LSE knows that their resource is going to be on outage for the month, and they know that well enough in advance, they could potentially inform the CPUC, and the CPUC does update the local allocations on a quarterly basis. So there might be ways for them to reshift the allocation if the plant outage was known well enough in advance and for whatever reason. But again, there's not really a link between outages and CPM. And so we're not really sure in implementation how we could kind of do what SCE is proposing, other than to say if that risk was continued to be carried by the CPE, there could be something on the CPE's end or the commission end where they have their own methodology for reallocating it once the CPE gets the bill. But again, the CAISO, we can't really see a way for us to make that distinction in the way that SCE is asking for.
Okay. I guess just thinking outside the box, unless in your system you go ahead and designate it to that self-showing LSE, and then that LSE can put those costs to the CPE if it was a planned outage. And I get that's not in your system. I'm just kind of thinking out loud that maybe that's a way of still getting there, but having maybe something in the decision that clarifies it, kind of a put that the LSE can have. But
sure. We're definitely, you know, what you do after you get the bill and who pays who after the fact, you know, that's definitely something I think, you know, commission and other parties could figure out, but again, it wouldn't be in the CAISO's processes.
Right, understood. Thanks so much.
Yep.
All right, and at this time, I don't have any more callers in queue.
Okay. We go to a few more slides in this section. So then finally, RMR cost allocation. For resources that the CAISO deems as a reliability must-run units, the CAISO allocates the cost of these resources to LSEs proportional to their load in each TAC area. The CAISO does not propose any modifications to the cost allocation methodology for RMR to account for the CPE, and will continue to allocate costs directly to LSEs. The CAISO will continue to give the CPUC the RMR credits to allocate to its jurisdictional LSEs or CPEs. And the CPUC can decide if it would like to allocate the local attributes of the resources to the CPE and the system flex attributes to the LSE, and the CAISO will accept this allocation. So our logic behind not changing the cost allocation methodology is, again, the CPE is a middleman, and so it makes more sense to sort of cut them out and go directly to, or maintain the relationship with the LSEs and give them the direct allocation. Next slide. So we received limited stakeholder feedback on this portion. The CPUC supported allowing LRAs to allocate the RMR credits amongst CPEs and LSEs. And then Middle River Power commented that the CAISO's proposal to only include the CPE in 2 of the 6 cost allocations, but not RMR cost allocation, seems to have little benefit. The CAISO clarifies that we designate RMR units based on reliability needs and not as a backstop to the RA program. And so we think it makes sense to treat them separately. And then because the CPE does not have a load share and is simply an RA procurement agent on behalf of LSEs, the CAISO believes it is justified in maintaining status quo on how it allocates costs of RMR units directly to LSEs based on their load share in each TAC area. So with that, I will pause to see if there's any final questions. This is also our last slide on the CPE implementation section. And so if folks have any questions on any other sections, feel free to raise those now.
All right, and then moving on to our caller in queue. And caller, your line is now unmuted.
Bridget, it's Brian Thaker with Middle River Power. I actually have two questions, one about RMR and one about CPM. Since we're on the RMR slide, let's go first. I am a little bit baffled about this first sub-bullet that RMR is not a backstop to the RA program. Would the ISO ever RMR a unit that wasn't required to be an RA unit?
So obviously RA and RMR both have the goal of ensuring reliability needs, and the CAISO does prefer that units be under RA contracts, and to the extent that they're not able to secure an RA contract with an entity, then we do have an RMR option that then gets, shared across all entities. And so because of that, it makes sense to keep things the status quo. Additionally, it doesn't really make sense to incorporate the CPE into the cost allocation methodology for this because they don't have a load share, and they, again, are just representative of all the other LSCs who do have load share, and so it just makes sense to sort of cut out the CPE because they would just reallocate those costs back to the LSCs they represent. And so in our minds, it just makes more sense to directly allocate out to the LSCs.
Okay, I think maybe I'm viscerally reacting to just the statement that RMR is not a backstop to the RA program. I find that a non sequitur, but let me ask about the cost allocation. If the ISO is giving the CAM credits to the CPE, and those are being allocated by the CPE, but they're allocating the RMR costs directly to LSCs. Is it possible there could be misalignment between the way the CAM credits are allocated and the way the costs are allocated?
Potentially, but again, it's up to the LRA to establish how they want to allocate those out. And again, if the LSCs aren't assigned local obligations, it shouldn't really matter if they don't get the local credit. And because the CPE doesn't have a system obligation, we are imagining the LRA will assign decision reflects attributes to the LSCs. And again, today, we give the credits to the LRAs, and so there already exists kind of that risk where the LRA may assign the credits differently than how we cost allocated. So it's basically continuing status quo, and we don't think the current RMR credit and cost allocation policy needs to change in light of the CPE.
Okay, I don't want to dominate the time, but I do have a question about CPM allocation. Shall I step out of the queue and come back for that, or ask it now?
You can ask it now.
Okay, it's a bigger picture question. I'll just give you a heads up in advance. We had some interesting results with the first round of CPE procurement with regard to multi-year requirements. I know the ISO has been very supportive of multi-year local and I think even system requirements. So I guess my big picture question, not related to the details on these slides, but still a question that comes to mind is, in that situation, shouldn't the ISO have a role in backstopping a deficiency in multi-year procurement? I know the ISO has been reticent to do that, but I'd like to hear your thinking as to why the ISO shouldn't have some role in backstopping a deficiency like that.
So I think that's something we'd have to sort of take back, and I think it would really depend on if more moved to multi-year requirements. So it's kind of out of scope for this current initiative, but as we advance in, the CPUC adopting multi-year for more than just local procurement, we could potentially talk more about that at that time. But again, because we're maintaining the annual showing construct, CPM will continue to be done on that sort of annual timeframe. So it's kind of out of scope for this initiative, and I don't know that we've thought much more beyond that, other than to say that we do think, multi-year does make sense in the long run, but until it becomes a material reality, it's hard to know or hypothesize how CPM should change as a result.
Okay, it is a material reality for local, right? And I'm not overstating the ISO's position on multi-year. Forgive me if I am.
No, we have supported multi-year in past CPC-RA proceedings.
Okay. One final question. I know the ISO is kicking off an initiative on CPM later this year. Is this something that should be brought into that initiative?
Yeah, I think it'd be perfectly acceptable to raise that in that stakeholder process for consideration, and especially when we're in the issue paper phase. We welcome that kind of proposal for consideration.
Okay, thank you, Bridget. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian.
Great, and then moving on to our next caller in the queue. Caller, your line is now unmuted.
Hi, Bridget. This is Natalie. I just had a quick question. Could you speak more about the CPM initiative or speak more about that at some point, about your CPM initiative enhancement?
Yeah, so it's an initiative that has been proposed on our roadmap. And so if you go to our policy catalog, which I think the final one will be posted by February at the latest, but I think the draft is out on the website now. That will provide you with the kind of description and potential scope. But when we launch that initiative, we'll go through our typical issue paper shop proposal. And so the exact scope of that initiative will kind of be developed in collaboration with stakeholders. But the idea is to kind of relook at CPM in recognition of just sort of the changing nature of the RA market. So revisiting things like flavors of CPM, the price cap, different ways to do cost justification, that kind of thing. So again, the scope is kind of open-ended at this point, and then will be established through that stakeholder process.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and at this time, I don't see any more callers in queue.
Okay, so that's it for the CPE process. We can pause again before we wrap the stakeholder call to see if anybody thinks of any additional questions. But with that, I will hand it over to James Lynn to cover the RAIM section. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. I want to confirm that you guys can hear me. I've been having some WebEx issues.
We can hear you.
Thank you. I'm going to address the RAIM settlement modifications as part of this proposal. If you can move to the next slide. What I'm going to do is give a little quick background on the current settlement process, and then we'll go into what the proposal is, as well as talk about some of the stakeholder comments. Now, RAIM was developed as part of the Reliability Services Initiative to create a two-tier incentive mechanism to ensure that RA resources bid in according to the must-offer obligation. It consists of a system of non-availability charges and availability incentive payments for the scheduling coordinators of the RA resources. These charges and credits are determined for each individual RA resource based upon an assessment of how often they bid into the a specific hours in which they're required based upon the RA capacity that was procured, both in day ahead and real time. If the resource falls below the 94.5 percentile of its month-off obligation, and this is over a calendar month, the ISO assesses a non-availability charge for that RA resource. If the resource is above or exceeds the 98.5 percentile, the resource now is eligible for an availability incentive payment for that month based upon any of the charges that we had procured from the assessment portion of RA resources. If the resource falls between the two, it does not receive either a charge or a payment. If you go to the next slide. There is a limited place on the amount of availability incentives that can be allocated at the end of the month and not on the amount of availability charge collected. What this means is that when we go to provide the payment for the availability incentive, it is self-funded, so it's based upon the amount of non-availability charges that have been collected. If there's any excess, so I have collected a certain amount of non-availability charges, and then I go to make the payment, and there is a threshold in which we can make the payment out to. If there's any excess above that threshold, that amount is carried forward to the following subsequent months to be included in the incentive payment for that subsequent month. At the end of the year, if there's any remaining unallocated assessment penalties, these are distributed to meter demand for generic and LSC obligations for flex. And this is where we are looking to make a potential change. If we could go to the next slide. This mechanism has created several challenges that were discussed at the ISO waiver request filed at FERC. The carry forward mechanism has created a financial issue when a settlement recalculation determines that an RA resource is due a refund or a reduction in RA range charges based upon new information of either for their availability or for exceptions. The only possible source for those refunds at that point becomes from a pool of rain penalties distributed in subsequent months. So therefore, if it's been allocated at the end of the year, we have to wait until the year end to get the subsequent money back to make those payments. If you can please make next slide. This waiting or this exposure of having to wait to recover the funds that or to make those payment refunds has caused a financial burden on both the ISO and ensuring that it has been backstopping that payment for the subsequent months. As such, the ISO proposes to modify the current range settlement process to eliminate the rule that unavailability charges assessed in excess of a monthly cap will roll over to funds allocated in future months. Rather than rolling these excess funds into next month, the ISO proposes to allocate the excess based upon the activity of the trading month according to the allocation formulas that currently applies to the year-end allocation. The ISO will allocate the excess rain charges for generic and RA to meter demand. What this means is that rain is intended to be self-funding. As part of that self-funding, if we have collected any rain assessment charges, they are to be allocated first to the rain incentive payments for RA resources that have met their RA obligation. And then if there's any subsequent excess funds, instead of carrying over to the next month, we would be allocating it to meter load of that month. So what we are going to do is, in essence, self-fund month to month, and we will not apply any assessments from the prior month to carry over into the next month. Can you go to the next slide, please? So what we believe this does, by eliminating the monthly rollover, ensures that the resettlement issues that necessitated our April 10th, 2020 FERC waiver filing will not reoccur. Allocating excess funds based upon meter demand will simplify the calculation. Allocating the excess funds to meter demand, LSEs will be compensated for resources that did not perform in accordance to their RA contract obligations. And this will address the burden of the ISO reserve account for ensuring that range settlement charges and credits all take place within the month in which they incurred. So this goes back to my comment about being self-funded. We are going to ensure that the RAIN mechanism is a self-funding mechanism, is self-funded from month to month, and does not have an undue burden onto the ISO when that funding gets carried over from one month to another. Now, I'm going to stop here before I go into the stakeholder comments to see if there's any questions.
It looks like we do have a couple of callers in queue, so going first to the phone line. And a caller, your line is now unmuted.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Apologies, I know I'm coming in at the draft final proposal, but it was my understanding that RAIN was a self-funding program, but it's supposed to be a primarily supplier incentive and supplier self-funding. So why allocate to load rather than just removing the 3x cap on the supplier benefits?
So what we're doing is we're ensuring that the self-funding mechanism, even though you are indicated that it was a supplier incentive, the reliability services indicated that there's any excess funds associated between the assessment of charges and the allocation of the payments should be redistributed to the meter demand or to load that procured the RA resource. What we're doing is maintaining that paradigm, but instead of carrying that over for an entire year period, since the LSEs are the ones that procure the resources, we believe that it's appropriate to bring that excess fund allocation into a month-by-month basis to provide the correct incentives for generation to make sure that their RA capacity is offered or available based upon their must-offer obligation, as well as ensure that the LSEs are compensated for those resources that have not met that must-offer obligation.
You know, I think, when we did the RAIN program, we had to do something with the funds at the end of December. And I think to keep it simple, we didn't think there'd be a lot, so we just allocated it to load. But I think this is a missed opportunity to strengthen the RAIN incentives because it is supposed to be to suppliers. That was the intent of the rollover in the first place, to make sure, suppliers got the maximum benefit from RAIN. So I don't really see this as consistent as you could make it with the intent of the policy. And again, I know I'm coming at the last minute, the final draft proposal, but I would ask that maybe you take a relook at it, and it would be just as easy to remove that 3 times cap, or maybe even increase the cap and split the benefits between supply and load if you are going to go to this monthly paradigm. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. I appreciate your comments.
All right, and then moving on to our next caller in queue. And caller, your line is now unmuted.
Hi, this is Noah Tong from Middle River Power. Happy New Year, James.
Question
for you. From what I understand, and I like to use numerical examples, is if a supplier or charged a penalty, let's call it, $100,000 for 1 month, that gets divvied out to other suppliers, and potentially there's a rollover to the next month if there's surplus. But then the next month or in future months, that $100,000 is in dispute, and the ISO needs to refund that instead of clawing it back from the suppliers to which the penalties were allocated to and rolled over. The ISO can't do that. Is that right?
It's not that we can't do it. Is the issue comes is that because let's say the 100,000, there is a rollover of 20,000, and each subsequent month I have excess funds that are from what was assessed to what was paid out that did not incorporate that 20,000. Let's say I'm now 6 months later, and I've now gotten to the point where I did not collect enough assessment payments to reach that cap. Well, now we are able to allocate out that $20,000. So when I have to do a refund on that, I'll resource that $100,000 assessment penalty, and the money now has to be paid back to that resource. The money that I have to collect it from, I have to collect it 6 months later. What that means, or even, and it's worse, it would be if it went all the way to the year end and I have to collect it from meter demand. So during that time period, the ISO has to fund that refund until we have that opportunity to run all of the statements and now procure the $20,000 back from the resources that were paid the incentive payment 6 months later. Does that make sense, Noah?
Yeah. So why not propose that you prioritize these refunds for the surpluses before, and if there's additional surplus, you continue to roll over until the year end?
Even if we put a prioritization to allocate it out, as long as I have continued rollover, I'm not. So to say January is, I do the assessment and that $20,000, I say it gets allocated out as part of February. But as long as February has excess funds, the settlement invoices is not going to claw back that $20,000 because the subsequent run, we do it on net changes. And so because there's not a net change in February, then I'm still waiting until I have a net change in this overall charge code to ensure that I get that $20,000 back in order to truly pay, offset that $20,000 refund. It is part of a counting mechanism that's causing the part of the issue.
I guess I don't understand what the net change means.
So if in January you were assessed $100,000 and I have refunded you that $100,000, in the RAIN assessment charge code, you will see a payment back of $100,000 on your subsequent invoice. Okay, so now when I look to see the amount of money that is changed from the resources that were received in incentive payment, if I don't see the full $100,000 change in that invoice, I have to now look at future invoices for the same type of net change. If February we have more assessments than we do have incentives, I'm not going to see a net change on the resources that were assessed, both the charges and the payment, so therefore I still have not collected the $20,000 that was carried over from that original $100,000 assessment. So what we have to keep doing is, keep running our statements and our invoices until we get to the period where that $20,000 is a net change on the assessment of, or the incentive payment of the resources to ensure that I have the funds that were originally distributed back in January.
But if we're trying to essentially fund the refund with surplus, right? It seems like you don't particularly need to look at the net change of every single generator that was paid out in incentive, but simply look at the net surplus on a monthly basis until you reach zero for that particular generator that received it. Right?
It's
so
not
it seems like you can.
It's not on a generator basis. It's on the overall charge code basis. So, so I'm trying to describe it in a way. Again, we'll say the total assessment was $100,000, and incentive payment was $80,000. I now carried over $20,000 into February. February, I had, and we'll make it real easy. I had 80 charges, 80 payments. So now I have to carry over that same 20. As long as I keep carrying it over, I am not collecting back that $20,000 that I am assessing out in future months in order to account for the change I'm going to have to make in January. The charge code itself, again, we're talking about being self-funded. And as long as the charges exceed the incentive payments and there's carryover, you have this exposure to the ISO when I change the charges.
Sorry, maybe I'm not following. Maybe you could help provide an example either in the final, proposal or something, because it's a little difficult to try to follow on the phone here.
Sure.
Or I'll try to reach out to you offline maybe as well. Thanks.
No problem though. I'll be happy to provide an example.
And at this time, I don't see any more callers in queue.
Okay, so if we can go on to the next slide. Now, stakeholder comments. Now, the ISO received supported comments from the CPUC, PG&E, and SCE for the proposed changes. CPUC supports this proposal and agrees that these changes will make RAIM a more effective mechanism. PG&E strongly supports the elimination of the RAIM carryover forward mechanism and believes that the ISO is well justified to move to a more simplified and fair process to distribute the excess RAIM charges. Cal-CCA did not offer any comments on this proposal, and CDWR did not object. Can you go to the next slide? MWD did raise a concern with our initial proposal related to the exclusion of market participants' load, which is associated with the transmission ownership rights. They argued that the market participants with TORs, that their generation participates in the ISO market, will be subject to RAIM penalties, but MWD would no longer be eligible to be allocated the excess penalties, which they argued does not appear fair, and asked for us to reconsider. Based upon some additional research, the ISO agrees with these concerns and has modified its policy to take out the TOR exemption, which allows market participants with TOR to be included in the meter demand calculations in which generic RA and flex RA are going to be eligible for the excess funds. If we can go to the next slide. Middle River Power opposes this policy change for numerous reasons. The first reason, Middle River objected to the inclusion of this portion of the policy of this change in the CPE implementation initiative rather than within the RA enhancement, or do it as a standalone initiative. We included it in this initiative because in April 2020, waiver with FERC, the ISO committed to seek long-term solutions to avoid the need to request further waivers, and the current timeline of RA enhancements put the ISO at a greater risk for needing additional waivers. As such, the ISO is renamed the initiative to better highlight the inclusion of range settlement modifications in the proposal and in the scope of this initiative. Middle River Power argued that the proposal would not address the underlying issue because unallocated range charges may not be sufficient to pay the refund on a monthly basis. The ISO disagrees with this assertion and argues that the proposed solution elimination of the monthly rollover would reduce the exposure and burden on the ISO, and this is because it should be a self-funding mechanism from a month-to-month basis. Next slide. Middle River Power argued that RAIN is already asymmetrically biased and that the incentive payments will only be paid out if there are charges assessed in that month. They've also argued that we should look at the lowering the availability targets and the 2% deadband to be centered on a 2.9% to reflect a more reasonable force outage rate. And Middle River Power also proposed that the meter demand should be charged to refund the RAIN incentive payments and not enough, if there's not enough penalties collected as part of the RAIN assessment. The ISO argues that generation already receives RA capacity payments that should cover their costs to be made available, and therefore are not entitled to additional payments if there's no RAIN charges assessed in that month by having us charged load. If the resources bidding falls before the 94.5% availability target agreed upon the parties, the ISO believes it's reasonable to distribute any excess penalties to load who paid for these resources to be available to the ISO. And charging load again to fund additional incentive payments could be viewed as a double payment. What this means basically is we believe that the resources that were procured from for RA from the LSCs have received payments for that capacity, and we should not be receiving additional payment if they have not made that capacity available by funding the incentive payment from LSCs. The other thing that I want to say is the request to look at the lowering availability targets and the 2.2% deadband. We will agree to look at that. It is not part of this particular modification and would require some studies and some research to be done before we can commit to making any modifications to the lower availability of the targets. Next slide, please. Middle River Power argued that if the ISO believes a resource that is penalized for 1 month should not be eligible for RAIN payments in later months, then the ISO should be structured RAIN to apply over a longer period of time. We want to clarify that the elimination of the monthly rollover would not prevent a resource from getting payments in future months if that assessment penalties in that current month, but would rather modify that the pool can be, is more of a self-funding within that month. Additionally, assessing RAIN over a longer period of time would also exacerbate the settlement issues in the policy that we're trying to address. And I believe this is my last stakeholder comment slide. Can we check? Now, if we could reach out for questions. I see we have one from Brian.
Right?
Yeah. Hi, James. Brian Baker with Middle River Power. You correctly anticipated that I have some things to question about. Let me take you back. Let me ask kind of an overarching question. Mm-hmm. The ISO implemented this rollover provision when it went to RAIN, and I believe that was 2016. It's been a while, right?
Yeah, we did the advisory period 2016. It actually went live in 2017.
Okay, thank you. Your memory is better than mine on this. So for 4 years, this was all just and reasonable, and everybody was fine with it. I'm just trying to ascertain when all of a sudden in the ISO's mind this became unjust and unreasonable. Was it really the April 2020 waiver that you filed? Is that the point that this rollover in the ISO's mind became unjust and unreasonable?
So I want to provide some clarity.
Hey, I'm gonna.
Go ahead, David.
James, let me cut you off there. We're not saying the existing rule is unjust and unreasonable, and I think that's really, mischaracterizing why the ISO necessarily makes any proposed tariff change. So I wouldn't agree with characterizing that as we're making the change because we say it's unjust and unreasonable. We have reasons for making it, and we will, make the case of why the changed rule is just and reasonable. But we don't have to say that the status quo is unjust and unreasonable to justify a change in the first place.
Okay, David, thank you for being more precise with the legal terminology. This waiver was filed in April 2020, but the ISO has only gotten around to making this proposal at this point. Can you explain why, if this is such an urgent or a necessary change to the settlement, why you guys sat on it for 1.5 years before proposing this change?
So I don't know, David, if you want me, I'll take this, answer this question. So
if someone can correct me. Oh, go ahead, James. You can take it.
No, go ahead, David.
My understanding was that this was scoped in the RA Enhancements Initiative to be dealt with at an earlier time, and that because that initiative has proceeded on a slower track, that we wanted to at least pull this element out of that and get it here where it could be moved along more quickly. So I don't think it's that we were just sitting on it and suddenly, a month ago or 2 months ago, we realized, oh, hey, wait a minute, we forgot about this. I think it was meant to be addressed somewhere else, and that initiative is, like I said,
David, thanks again. Your memory on that is better than mine. I don't remember this being scoped. Can you point me to one of the early RA enhancements proposals where this was scoped?
I'll have to get back to you on that, Brian.
Okay.
I do.
I'm sorry, James. One last question.
Sure.
This exposure really existed from the time the ISO implemented this policy, right? This exposure has always been there, but it was exposed by the waiver that you filed, or this resettlement that happened in April 2020. Is that right?
So that's why I wanted to get. There was this potential exposure became apparent to us in 2017, and we were able to address that exposure based upon a good faith negotiation settlement with a participant. And then subsequently, we have become aware that this exposure is ongoing. And so when we had to make the filing in April 2020, we realized that this, as being an ongoing exposure, needed to be addressed, so that we committed to FERC to address it by coming up with a long-term solution that would eliminate the ISO from having to file subsequent waivers.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the history on that. One other thing I say, you touched on it. I appreciate the ISO willing to take a look at the target. We noted that when you guys filed some comments at the PUC, you offered that 92.5% availability seemed to be where the fleet was. That's not where the RAIN target is, so that's why we put that in our comments. But I appreciate the ISO's willingness to relook at that. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
All right, at this time, I don't have any more callers in queue.
Okay, well, I would thank everybody for their time, and I'm going to hand this over to Jimmy to address the additional outstanding roles.
So this is Bridget. I'll actually go over the EIM governing body designation. So we believe that this initiative scope falls outside the EIM governing body joint authority designation. So none of the tariff rule changes currently contemplated in this initiative would be applicable to EIM entity, balancing authority areas, EIM entities, or other market participants within the EIM entity balancing authority area in their capacity as an EIM participant. And so the proposed tariff rules would only be applicable to CAISO balancing authority area or to the CAISO control grid. And so because of this, the scope falls outside the scope of joint authority. Next slide. We also believe that this initiative scope falls outside the EIM governing body advisory role. And so the EIM governing body may provide advisory input over proposals to change or establish tariff rules that would apply to the real-time market, but are not within the scope of joint authority. And so no aspects of this initiative would apply or impact the real-time market, and therefore the initiative falls outside the EIM governing body advisory role. And so the CAISO received some more supportive comments of this EIM classification from PG&E and CalCCA, and stakeholders are encouraged to submit additional comments or questions in support or opposition of this EIM classification. So with that, I'll pause again to see if there's any final questions on the CPE or RAIN settlement before we wrap up today's stakeholder call.
And at this time, I don't see any callers in queue.
Great. Well, with that, thanks everyone for your participation today. We look forward to reviewing your comments that are due January 20th. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Jimmy for concluding remarks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Bridget. And thank you as well, James. And of course, the questions, great questions, very much appreciated throughout this process. We are asking for comments, as Bridget noted, on the 20th. Happy New Year once more. This was recorded. You can look for that to be available in the next couple of business days. And there is the initiative page for ease of reference. You'll find the commenting tool through that link, as most are familiar with, and we will have the template for that posted shortly. So we look forward to your comments. And with that, have a great rest of your day, folks.